Prioritization of risks. As briefly mentioned before, we need to prioritize risks so that we can adequately select responses to risks. This is one way organizations adopt in order to inform decision-making on risk responses and optimize the allocation of resources. Given the resources available to an entity, management must evaluate the trade-offs between allocating resources to mitigate one risk compared to another. The prioritization of risks, given their severity, the importance of the corresponding business objective, and the entity's risk appetite, helps management in its decision-making. Priorities are determined by applying agreed-upon criteria. Some examples provided in COSO ERM of these criteria include adaptability, that is, the capacity of an entity to adapt and respond to risk. For example, responding to changing demographics such as the age of the population and the impact on business objectives relating to product innovation. Complexity, the scope and nature of a risk to the entity's success. The interdependency of risks will typically increase their complexity. For example, risks of product obsolescence and low sales to a company's objective of being market leader in technology and customer satisfaction. Velocity, the speed at which risk impacts an entity. The velocity may move the entity away from the acceptable variation in performance. For example, the risk of disruptions due to strikes by port and custom officers affecting the objective relating to efficient supply chain management. Persistence, how long a risk impacts an entity. For example, the persistence of adverse media coverage and impact on sales objectives following the identification of potential brake failures and subsequent global car recalls. Recovery, the capacity of an entity to return to tolerance. For example, continuing to function after a severe flood or earthquake or any other natural disaster. Recovery excludes the time taken to return to tolerance, which is considered part of persistence, not recovery. Prioritization takes into account the severity of the risk compared to risk appetite. Greater priority may be given to those risks likely to approach or exceed risk appetite. Risk prioritization is one of the key elements of an effective risk management system for any organization. Risk responses. Once you identify a risk, you need to decide what do you want to do with it. In deciding a response to a risk, you will select and deploy a risk response. You should consider the severity and prioritization of the risk as well as the business context and associated business objectives. Finally, your selected risk response should also account for the performance targets of the organization. Risk responses usually fall within the following categories. Except no action is taken to change the severity of the risk. This response is appropriate when the risk to strategy and business objectives is already within risk appetite. Risk that is outside the entity's risk appetite and that management seeks to accept will generally require approval from the board or any other oversight body. Avoid. Action is taken to remove the risk, which may mean ceasing a product line, declining to expand to a new geographical market, or selling a division. Choosing avoidance suggests that the organization was not able to identify a response that would reduce the risk to an acceptable level of severity and bring it within the organization's risk appetite. Pursue. Action is taken that accepts increased risk to achieve improved performance. This may involve adopting more aggressive growth strategies, expanding operations, or developing new products and services. When choosing to pursue risk, Management understands the nature and extent of any changes required to achieve desired performance, while not exceeding the boundaries of acceptable tolerance. Reduce. Action is taken to reduce the severity of the risk. This involves any of the myriad everyday business decisions that reduces risk to an amount of severity aligned with the target residual risk profile and risk appetite. A lot of the normal day-to-day control mechanisms are actually part of reducing the identified or unidentified risks, plus any other additional responses. Share. Action is taken to reduce the severity of the risk by transferring or otherwise sharing a portion of that risk. Common techniques include outsourcing to specialist service providers, purchasing insurance products, and engaging in hedging transactions. As with the reduced response, sharing risk lowers residual risk in alignment with risk appetite. Risk universe. Totality of all risks that may impact an organization's objectives. It is usually the theoretical risk exposure, but organizations do make an effort to document their risk universe so they understand at least to an extent what is the total exposure of the organization. Risk profile. As per COSO ERM, the risk profile is a description of the risk of an enterprise, resulting from the risk assessment. It provides information on the entity's current amount of risk and how risk is distributed across the entity, as well as on the different categories of risk for the entity. New organizations will not have an existing risk profile to draw from, but they may be able to get valuable information from their industry and competitors. COSO recommends in Principle 6 that requires organization to analyze business context, that the organization should consider potential effects of business context on risk profile. At the highest level, enterprise risk management is integrated with strategy setting, with management understanding the overall risk profile for the entity and the implications of the alternative strategies to that risk profile. Management specifically considers any new opportunities that arise through innovation and emerging pursuits. Generally, boards and management should define a target risk profile, meaning the desired spread of risk across the defined risk categories, and then regularly compare and monitor the actual risk profile to guide its actions. Risk register. It's simply a structured record of all the relevant details of identified key risks and their analysis. The risk register is where the risks identified during risk assessment are recorded. As a result, the risk register normally is updated regularly, depending on the organization's preferences, maybe monthly or quarterly. During the update, the assessments of previously identified risks are reviewed. New risks identified and assessed. The status and effectiveness of existing risk treatment plans assessed, and new risk treatment plans developed as required for both existing and new risks. The result is an updated risk register. This concludes our discussion of the relevant and important ERM concepts and terms. See you soon.